Thomas Arnold, the great historian of Islam in the early 20th century. He said Sir Thomas Arnold was a historian. And then his student, Sir Hamilton Gibb, was a historian and a philologist. And then he pointed out to himself, Leonard Binder was Sir Hamilton Gibb's student at Harvard. And I'm not only a historian and a philologist, but a social scientist. So you see the growth and the development from one generation to another. Sir Thomas Arnold, a philologist. His student, Sir Hamilton Gibb, philologist and historian. And his student, Leonard Binder, philologist, historian, and a social scientist. And then he looks at me. I said, well, Lenny, I'm not worthy of carrying that great tradition, but if you don't mind, I can tell you one thing, that all of you didn't have one thing that I have. And he looked at me with very raised eyebrows, and he said, what is that we all lacked that you have? I said, none of you were a Muslim, and I am a Muslim. That makes the difference. Why I'm making this point, I absolutely have no contribution towards the development of Islamic studies in the American university. But I'm referring this only to let you know that a major milestone in the history of Islamic studies in the United States was reached in the 1970s, not because I went to US, but with the arrival of some of the most important Muslim scholars of Islamic studies in the United States. See that now? Professor Fazlur Rahman arrived at the University of Chicago in 1969. Professor Ismail Faruqi, whose name is there, he taught at Temple University. Professor Abdulaziz Sajadina, who taught at University of Virginia at Charlottesville. Professor Azim Nanji, an Ismaili Muslim scholar, who taught at University of Florida. Mahmoud Ayub, a blind Lebanese Islamic scholar who taught at Toronto, then at Temple, and now probably at the Harvard Seminary. All of them firmly rooted in traditional Islamic sciences. All of them, they were scholars of Arabic, scholars of Persian and Turkish. Fazlur Rahman knew Latin and Greek and German and French and Spanish and Ottoman Turkish and Persian and Urdu and Arabic, of course, and Punjabi was his mother tongue. So was Faruqi, who knew Hebrew. And they were extremely deeply rooted in classical Islamic sciences. And they were the ones who laid the foundation for Islamic humanities, and they trained hundreds of young scholars in the mainstream of Islamic studies. And then, after them, you have a new generation of young Muslim scholars in the United States, in the mainstream of Islamic studies. People like Noman al-Haq, who did his PhD from Harvard. He's now teaching at Lumps, Lahore, but he goes back to the United States every year. You have Khalid Blankenship, a historian at University of Temple, who has translated Dabri and done great work in early Umayyad history. You have Jonathan Brown at Georgetown University, who is the probably foremost scholar of Hadith. And many people, I am not a scholar of Hadith, I don't know much about the literature in that field, but people who are expert in the field, they tell me that you rarely have a scholar of his talent. That is the Muslim Jonathan Brown. Only after 2-3 generations you get a scholar of his talent. It's very young, teaching at Georgetown. Then you have Mustansar Mir at Youngstown University, a Pakistani, who is a great scholar of Quran. You have Qasim Zaman, very well rooted in classical Islamic studies, Islamic history. You have Amina MacLeod, Amina Wadood, Marcia Harmanson. You have Asma Afsaruddin, you have Asma Prakash, you have Amelia Sombal. And then you have many other Muslim scholars who are not in the mainstream of Islamic studies. They are sociologists, they are students of literature, comparative literature, humanities, philosophy, political. But they are engaged in fundamental debate about Islamic studies in the United States. Sabah Mahmood, a Pakistani anthropologist who teaches in California, is one of them. Mahmood Mamdani, I mentioned his name earlier. Talal Asad, an anthropologist. He's not an Islamic studies person, but his contribution towards the debate in Islamic studies is absolutely first rate. Then you have Ahmad Dalal at Georgetown University. You have Ubaid Safi at Duke University, at University of Charlottesville. Not Charlottesville. Yeah, wonderful young man. And then these are some of the things that we have to be proud of. And the field of Islamic studies in the American University is changing because of this Islamic scholarship. When I went to the United States in 1976, there are only 3 names of Muslim professors: Fazl Rahman, Ismail Faruqi, Hussein Nasar. And obviously, I mean, these 3 are giants. Suleiman Nayamet, I wrote an article during those early 1980s, and the title of the article was Muslim Intellectual Immigrants in the United States. And we developed 3 categories, 3 schools of thought: Fazl Rahman as a liberal modernist, and Ismail Faruqi as a not what we call the kind of, we didn't call him fundamentalist, but something like that. And Hussein Nasr as neo-traditionalist. But they were the only 3 names. And now you go to any good university in the United States and you will find a Muslim scholar. Muslim scholars are now becoming in charge of these things. Let me finish by making one thing. As I said earlier, that the tradition of Islamic studies has become much more stronger today than it was a few decades ago. One reason is that the tradition has matured. It has learned from its mistakes. Secondly, I will probably not do justice to this audience if I don't mention one name who changed and revolutionized the entire field of Islamic studies and Middle Eastern studies. And that's, may Allah bless his soul, Edward Said. I think if one is a true historian of American scholarship, one can divide the history of American scholarship on Islam into eras, pre-Saidian and post-Saidian. Before 1978, when he published his book Orientalism, and after 1978, when the book was published, the field changed enormously. Edward Said was the one who offered a devastating critique of the fundamental assumptions of Islamic studies and of Orientalist scholarship, with its emphasis on essentialism, reductionism, and study of texts only, ignoring the context. It was Edward Said who demolished these fundamental assumptions of Orientalism, and he ushered a new era in which younger scholars moved out of the Orientalist tradition of Bernard Lewis type of people and opened up the field for new inquiries. So if there are some healthy signs, new approaches, theoretical and methodological approaches to the study of Islam in the United States, much of it owes to the contribution of Edward Said. The field remained, did not remain the same after his contribution. And there is no scholar who writes today about the field of Islamic studies without not engaging Edward Said. But unfortunately, as I said earlier, one major failure of the area of studies and Islamic studies program in the United States has been its disconnect with both the American public opinion as well as with the American public policy. When President Bush and Dick Cheney decided to invade Iraq, they did not invite John Esposito or John Wall to advise them. They invited Bernard Lewis, who told Vice President Cheney that, Mr. Vice President, when the American troops will enter Baghdad, people will welcome them with sweets and with flowers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mumtaz, for a very thought-provoking presentation. I don't want to attempt to summarize, but what Professor Mumtaz had just said reminds me of dominance of culturalism, the discourse of Islam, basically linking theology and the Quran to violence and extremism, and how culturalism itself has conditioned the way people respond to problems. Also, look at the Quran and say that this is a moderate interpretation and this is an accepted version. And also, Professor Mumtaz has also talked about how Islamic studies is very much related to the United States strategic considerations. And he talked about the Cold War, the post-9/11, the Iranian Revolution. Throughout his presentation, I was actually also thinking and reflecting about the state of Islamic studies in Australian universities. In Down Under, basically there's still this dominance of the Clifford Geertz kind of scholarship, meaning that you go to
Literal Islam and literal tradition. Islam is different from Indonesian Islam, is different from Moroccan Islam.
Yeah. So there's this strong interest in Indonesia,
Yeah.
as opposed to Americans who are not very much interested in Indonesia. So there's always studying small things, visiting villages, and then generalizing it as Islam. So basically, these are the things that I gathered from the presentation. So I shall now open the floor for Q&A. So please feel free to ask.
Hi, my name is Rizwana. Thank you very much, Prof Mumtaz, for your very enlightening talk. I have a question about, how the scholars of Islam in America, if they are trained in anthropology, sociology, as opposed to Islamic studies, do they have different orientations in terms of the subject matter that they study, in terms of the theoretical framework that they use to analyze data and so on? And do they have influence in other parts of the world, for example, in the UK, students studying Islam and so on, are they disseminating their ideas to people in the UK and elsewhere? So that's two questions.
I think the incorporation of Islam, the study of Islam within the social science discipline has been a step forward, particularly for American anthropologists and sociologists. Some of the studies that I have seen done by American anthropologists about Islam, what they call the lived Islam, rather than Islam in the textbooks, right? They study experiential Islam as it is lived and experienced in everyday life by the particular Muslim communities. Their ethnographic studies, monographic studies are much more deeper in terms of their insights than the usual studies by Islamic studies scholars. Islamic studies scholars mostly talk about at a highly generalized level. An anthropologist always talks at the micro level. He studies one small village and studies in depth. And he and she spends years with the local communities. They live with them. And there's another interesting difference is when an Islamic studies scholar goes to field work, he or she wants to impose his own preconceived categories on the subject. An anthropologist does not impose his own categories on the subjects. He wants his subjects to speak up and tell their own stories. That's why I think the anthropological studies of Islam and Muslim societies are much richer, more insightful than the studies done by political scientists or by the economists or by the Islamic studies scholars. I'm not a great fan of Clifford Geertz, although his book, Islam Observed, became a Bible for the anthropologists of 2 generations earlier. Now, of course, nobody reads Clifford Geertz, particularly in America and Australia, maybe. Australia is about 30 years behind America. So, Clifford Geertz himself wrote, recently published a book. Have you seen that? 2 cultures, 40 years, 1 anthropologist. Yeah. Basically, he looks back 40 years earlier when he first went to Morocco and to Indonesia and observed it. He goes back to the same villages in Morocco and in Indonesia after 40 years. Now, anthropology discipline has changed during 40 years. The anthropologist himself has changed because he has learned some more things that he didn't know when he was young. And Indonesia and Morocco have changed. So that's the fun of it. So I would say at any given time, at any time of the day, I'm willing to read an anthropologist rather than an Islamic studies scholar. Look at the works by this Harvard anthropologist. He did work on Iran. I can't forget one thing. There is a last name is Egler, Zakia Egler, a Harvard anthropologist who did his work on Pakistan, a Punjabi village in Pakistan. It's basically a study of religious practices in a Punjabi village. Some of them are one of the most profound works one can read, but only an anthropologist can write it. What was the second question?
The dissemination of ideas, the flow of ideas from the US to the UK and elsewhere.
It's very strange. I have always wondered why there is no transatlantic communication at the academic level. I think there is some kind of snobbishness on the part of the British that they don't give much importance to the American scholarship. And similarly, what is published in England mostly remains unknown to many scholars in the United States. I'll give you one example, and this is not a recent example. Colin Lees published a book on theories of modernization and development. This was published in the late 70s somewhere. Lees is a good scholar from, I think, Cambridge or Oxford. Great development or political development scholars. It's a wonderful book. There is not a single reference to any American scholar. And that was the period when the American scholars had contributed most to the study of development theory and modernization theory. Remember the Social Science Research Council publication, Political Development and Communication, Political Parties and Political Development, and Crisis of Political Development, and Bureaucracy and Political Development. He doesn't mention a single book. Similarly, Leonard Binder, who published a book again on Iran, modernization of traditional monarchy. And again, that was the time when his book was published. What was his name? Fred Halliday had published one book on Iran. A couple of other British scholars were, but no mention. So I don't see much impact of the American scholarship, dissemination of American scholarship on, across the Atlantic. This is unfortunate, but there appears to be some undeclared war.
Thank you so much, Professor Mumtaz, for such a fascinating and very good talk. I have two questions, one which recalls the past history and another which talks about the future, projections into the future. So my first question is really, I'm curious to know, in University of Chicago, there was this project on Islam and social change on which you were a part of, and Professor Prof Ahmad as well. I haven't found much documentation on this project other than Professor Leonard Binder's book on Islamic liberalism. My question is, how does that project fit into the larger contextual interest in Islam that you were talking about, you were tracing? I think that book was published by the Chicago Press in the 1980s, late 1980s. So that's the first question. And question number two is, at the University of Chicago, I think 2 years ago, the Mellon Foundation started this initiative, Islamic Studies Initiative, and I noticed that there is an interest in recruiting Shiite scholars. So, in your opinion, what would be the future projections of Islamic studies? Because I see, that maybe following American foreign policy and interest in Iran and Shias. So, what would be the future projections?
Very important, very interesting questions, and very thoughtful questions indeed. I'm very happy you asked me questions about the University of Chicago. Or any other place I wouldn't have known much. Okay, going back to your first question. Islam and Social Change Project was conceived in 1975. And the idea was to compare 6 Muslim societies, 6 Muslim countries, with reference to the role of Islamic education and the ulama in the process of social change and modernity. The emphasis was on madrasa education and traditional Islamic education. But look at the phenomenon. We're talking of 1975. No one in the Muslim world, or anywhere in the world, was thinking about the madrasas. You go through the literature produced by any country in the world, Muslim, non-Muslim, And if you can show me the word madrasa in any of the scholarly discourse, said Master, nobody was talking about it. Suddenly, Leonard Wider and Fazl Rahman came up with the idea that nobody has studied these madrasas. And my God, what is happening there? Who are these people? Who are the students? Who are the teachers? What is being taught? And what is going to be the impact of this kind of education on the process of social change in these societies? So they write a proposal, give it to the Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation gives them the money. And then they, mid-75, or probably June, July, they go about and recruiting people from 6 Muslim countries. I don't know what was the reason. I was lucky to be recruited by Fazl Rahman from Pakistan. Nur Khalis Majid was recruited from Indonesia. Sharaf Akhwi was recruited from Iran. Plus another anthropologist, Mike Fisher, who was already doing work on Qom, the city. Morocco, Donali Ball was recruited from Morocco, who was doing her PhD at that time, Imarman girl. She's now teaching at Utah, University of Birmingham. Who else was there? Chris Eckel was recruited for Egypt. So, Egypt, Morocco, Turkey, Iran, Indonesia, Pakistan. These are the 6 countries. I did some field work from the middle up to the end of, January, December 1975, and arrived in Chicago on the 1st of January at exactly 0 hours for the media. We met for 6 months and exchanged the findings of our research. That was probably one of the finest projects that was done. But the Ford Foundation didn't ask for any finished product. And they said, do whatever you want to do with whatever you have found out. Nur Khalis Majid incorporated his finding in his dissertation. Chris Eckel published a couple of monographs, then a book. Sharaf Akhwi wrote a book on religion and politics in Pahlavi, Iran. Because by the time Sharaf Akhwi was writing his report, the Iranian Revolution had taken place. Michael Fisher, who was going to write a report on his project, and the tentative title he gave us the Qom report, because he was working in Qom. After revolution, the Qom report was not selling. So probably he changed his title to Shahada, Martyrdom, and Qom. Fazl Rahman wrote his book Islam and Modernity, that came out from this project. Binder wrote his book Islamic Liberalism. I incorporated some of the things in my dissertation, plus I wrote 3 or 4 monographs that were published, surprisingly one in Paris, journal, and others in the Mandarin journal. So the project, we did try to do share the findings of the project in some form or the other. The fundamentalism project came later, much later, 1988 to 1991. And that was much more successful project because it published 5 volumes of this huge Each volume is about 700-800 pages and this big. It was a really encyclopedic work, the fundamentals of project. That was a bigger project that continued for several years. So this was your first question. It's true that the interest of many of the American academies, universities, is increasing now to explore Shiism, and also not 12 Shiism, but Ismaili. There were very few positions available for the Ismaili scholars, and very few courses on Ismailism. But now I understand that several universities, they have a program of Ismaili studies. Ismaili scholars are being recruited. Azim Nanji was in Center for Ismaili Studies back in London. Now he has been brought back to the United States. 3 other Ismaili scholars. Faisal Devji, who did his PhD from the University of Chicago, is also Ismaili, wonderful scholar. He went to England, then he's getting back to the United States. He's being offered a position. In Shia, one interesting thing I wanted to share is that the 3 most important scholars of Islamic studies in American universities in the 70s and 80s were Shias. Hussein Nasr, Sajadina, and Mahmoud Ayyub. All 3 Shias. None of them presented himself as a Shia. They were the most non-sectarian scholars you can think of. Absolutely. And in the courses they taught Islam, which was a Sunni Islam. Because they could not hide the fact that the Shia tradition is a minority tradition within Islam. And if they are an honest scholar, when they teach Islam, they teach quote-unquote Sunni Islam. And then they would say, well, there is a Shia version also. So Hussein Nasr was never a Shia professor. Sajadina was never a Shia professor. And nor was Mahmoud Ayyub. And we who, at that time, we were young. Now I cannot say we the young people. In the 70s, the young students at the graduate schools, we looked up to them as our mentors, as our guardians, as our ustad, as our murshid. Never it occurred to us that they were Shias and we were Sunnis. The interest in studying Shiism as a separate discipline, of course, is related to the US interest in Iran. And that, I believe, will increase. If you look at the, you don't need to look at that. The CIA bulletin, for example, or the FBI bulletin, situation vacant, right? What type of people we are looking for? Language experts. In the 80s, for example, Persian was #1. Then in the 90s and early, nobody bothered about Persian. Then in the 80s, mostly late 80s, Pashto, Dari, the Afghanistan, because the Soviets were in Afghanistan. And now again, Pashto language, the Afghan language, is the most important among the categories that the FBI is looking for. Now, if you look at the situation vacant of the FBI and CIA and defense intelligence, Persian is again #1. These are the indicators. You don't read these stories in the New York Times.
Thank you, Prof. I really enjoyed your lecture. And I'm glad that you mentioned the name Edward Said and his important contribution in really changing the landscape of Islamic studies in Western universities especially. But the term Orientalism that he has coined to refer to a certain phenomenon, unfortunately, is also one of the most abused and misunderstood concept, particularly in the other side, which is in the Muslim societies. In the sense that, you know, when Said was talking about this essentialism and reductionism of Islam, that very same mode is also being used in declaring Western societies in a certain manner, which is what, if I'm not mistaken, Tibawi calls it Orientalism in reverse.
Sadiq Jalal al-Azhar.
Yeah, Sadiq Jalal al-Azhar. And this is the problem, I feel, because no one has really made such a huge contribution to Islamic studies in modern times as compared to Edward Said with his seminal work of Orientalism. And yet, whatever that, I mean, in Muslim societies, you find people who just dismiss anything that comes from Western universities as Orientalist, stroke Christian agenda, stroke Zionist agenda, stroke, you know, whatever it is. And this is a problem, without realizing that Edward Said himself is a Christian, Palestinian Christian, and he has done so much to the field of Islamic studies. So this is the irony that we fail to confront within our own society. That's one. Secondly, it's interesting because after Said's time, much has changed in the landscape. I've read a recent book by a wonderful scholar, Hamid Dabashi, which I'm sure you know, Brown Skin, White Mask.
I have that book.
Yeah, it's an excellent book.
The most polemical and the most interesting book.
Yeah. And this is where, relating to an earlier point, that a lot of good scholarship that comes out from American universities do not translate or trickle down into popular imagination and popular discourse. It's precisely because now we have informants, he calls it informers, as compared to the earlier informants, who are native scholars providing data for the Orientalist scholars to then tell them what their societies are. Now these informers are coming from native lands, and they are occupying the central in the hierarchy. You know, they are the middle ground that actually informs and align themselves to American interests, and they are quite fluid in their movement. People like Farid Zakaria and Azan Nafisi, and that most notorious one, Fuad Ajami, yeah. And these are the ones who actually dominates popular imagination, and they unfortunately comes from their own society, and now they are depicting their own society in such a manner that is really the Orientalist scholars do not need anymore white men to tell bad things about your community. You know, you now have their own people telling bad things about their own community, and they are the one informing the American foreign policies on these matters. Now, what are your comments on this? And this is what is blocking the masses from having access to the topmost scholarships coming from American universities.
I would say, everything that you have said. I have nothing to add, because you raised the points much better than I would have done it. I do agree that Edward Said's insights on Orientalism are being misused and abused by many Muslim scholars, and particularly Muslim Islamic movements themselves. What Edward Said was criticizing was the attitude of the Orientalist to reduce Islam to certain essential characteristics based on text. What the Islamic movements want us to do, Muslim, is to consider Islam as a reduced intellectual and moral category of certain essential features, and say, this is the Islam. As Bernard Lewis was telling us, this is the Islam. So both Panna Lewis and some of the Islamic quote-unquote fundamentalist writers are doing exactly the same. There's no difference between them. Fundamentalism in reverse, or Orientalism in reverse. And then Sadiq Jalal Azam's critique and Ejaz Ahmed's critique is a little unkind and brutal against Edward Said, but they do have a point. I think both Sadiq Jalal Azam and Ejaz were a little unkind to Edward Said because they didn't see the fundamental humanitarian message that constituted the subtext of his critique on Orientalism. He was a humanist par excellence, and he was not, the kind of person that was represented later on by these people. So I agree with your comment. On the second point, again, you're absolutely right. These are the things that we need to avoid, and to understand that even a Christian can be a sympathetic scholar of Islam. Thank you very much.
Prof, thank you very much for such an insightful lecture. Shall I address this Professor Ahmad, coming from the British tradition? At least we call him Professor Mumtaz, so I was just wondering whether the excitement of the scholarship, the Islamic studies scholarship in America, will eventually find its way to Asia and Middle East in particular, as well as in Islamic University in Islamabad, for example. What would be the kind of ingredients or what would be the accelerators of life that will make that happen? Because I fear that such scholarship will never exist in the West, in particular in the US, never mind in Britain or in Europe. And if we're not careful, given the order of the day and global changes, such motivations can take a different trajectory, and it's not actually being benefited and being put to good use, if you like, in other parts of the Muslim world and in other parts of the world. So I'd just like to hear from you what would be the necessary triggers. I'll just give you an simple example. Many of my friends who comes from the Muslim community, and when they eventually study Islamic studies in the West, eventually stay in the West, very few of them actually come back to their homeland and try and do a transformation, if you like, in the Institute of Higher Learning or in the university. So, very, very few of them actually do come back, unless they've been wanted by the government or unless they have been, sort of. So I fear that that's not happening, and I just want to hear your thoughts.
That's very unfortunate.